Thanks, everyone, so much for joining us, the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad right now to be joined by Kym Staton, who's a filmmaker, poet, and musician from New South Wales, Australia. He's the writer and director of The Trust Fall, Julian Assange, and the founder and director of Films for Change. He won an award for Best Emerging Director Australia at the Melbourne Documentary Film Festival in 2023. The Trust Fall comes out in US cinemas on July 17th. Kym, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Eleanor. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And I must congratulate you on a very powerful and beautifully made film. And it must be perhaps the most joyous event of feeling that you might have to do an updated edit of that film.
Yeah, it's a good thing. The film was made with the aim to add weight to the campaign for Julian's freedom, and guess what? Here we are. He's free. He's with his family. He's even in my country. He might end up being my neighbor one day.
You would be so lucky. Um, And I wanna get right into the film because there's a lot that I really appreciated about it, but something that in particular that I wanted to start with was, an interview with Nils Melzer, who's the former UN Special Rapporteur on torture, and he became very outspoken about what was being done to Julian, and yet he highlights, how he initially ignored the request to take a look at Julian Assange's case because he felt, quote, that it was just this hacker, this traitor. And he admits that he didn't know where he got his negative emotions towards Julian from, that he recognized that he was emotionally convinced, even though he didn't actually know about Julian's case. And he goes on to say that, quote, if you think that Assange is a traitor, a rapist, a hacker, I don't blame you because you have been deceived. And if you think you've not been deceived, that's normal. Otherwise, it wouldn't be deception, end quote. And I think that's such a powerful quote. And in your film, you cover both his personal life going back all the way to his school days, but also his professional life. And I'm curious, what did you notice in your research and filming that hit with people the most? Was it the personal character assassinations, like, oh, he's just a hacker and a rapist? Or was it more the professional side, like, oh, he's guilty of so-called treason or terrorism?
Yeah, I like that you picked up on that Nils Melzer statement. I found Nils' involvement in this was very pivotal, being in his role as UN Special Rapporteur on Torture at the time that he'd visited Julian in prison with two other doctors, one of which we feature in the film, Paul Sellers. He visited Julian in Belmarsh a few years ago, and they assessed him under the Istanbul Protocol for Torture and determined that he was a victim of torture. And that line that you mentioned, which we put in the film, that Neil says that he felt like he already had an opinion on Assange, but he didn't know where he had it from. I just felt that was so relevant to so many people. Like, I put that in the film because I felt like, especially at that point where we've just attempted to, debunk and dismantle those smears, those main smears that Julian is a rapist, a hacker, a traitor, a Russian agent, that he didn't redact. Putting that line of Nils right there was intended so that the audience could be invited to actually, just identify with Nils and say, yeah, that's me. I had that same thought, those doubts about Julian based on his character. I bought into the false narratives that have been created, that whole web of lies that have been spun about him. So that was placed there to be so that hopefully it would be a turning point for those people that still had some prejudice or some doubts. And I think those are still prevalent. I mean, even after his release, we had even the Australian media, um, these rubbish rags, The Age and the Australian newspaper and Sky News, um, just regurgitating, recycling those smears, especially the one about he put lives at risk. And it was just astonishing especially in the actual court hearing. I'm not sure if you heard the audio from Saipan, um, where the judge uh, literally recognized that no lives were put at risk, and that was part of the basically the acceptance by the US that no one had been harmed was basically presented as part of the reason that he could you know, have that plea deal, and for them to, you know, reduce the indictment, the counts of the indictment, basically from 18 counts down to one count, one single count that he pleaded guilty for. So Judge Manlolna, this is the quote from what she said in the courtroom in Saipan 2 weeks ago. Quote, "There's another significant fact. The government has indicated there is no personal victims here. That tells me the dissemination of this information did not result in any known physical injury," end quote. And that's a confirmation of that really important fact that the WikiLeaks disclosures did not cause anyone harm. And that's on top of the original debunking of this claim, which occurred in 2013 at the trial of Chelsea Manning in the US at Fort Meade, uh, where the Pentagon had to admit under oath that no lives had been put at risk. And yet you still had Sky News Australia do their coverage. And the first thing I heard one of their, hack journalists say was, he put lives at risk. However, the public are applauding him as a hero and he's home and he's blah, blah, blah. So they use that as a preface to their whole segment as if it was fact. And that's one of, many Australian journalists and I guess UK as well, and the US, where they're just using these false narratives repeatedly without doing any research of their own. What does that say about them as so-called journalists, that they can't even do any kind of research on what is the truth about the matter?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to get into that because you know, I obviously live in the United States and I'm also Swedish, so I can speak to, and I used to say, I'm glad I'm Swedish. Now I don't anymore. But I can speak to how people in the US and indeed Sweden view Julian Assange very twistedly. But I'm curious about how people in Australia, his home country, view Julian, and if that was an impetus to why you wanted to make this film. Was it to shift opinion also at home? Like how has the perspective of Julian been in his own home country?
Yeah, we definitely want to shift the opinion of those that are still on the fence and have doubts and unsure. But more so just to give people a real understanding of why they went after Julian. Why did they persecute him? How was he treated? Uh, the whole extent of the awful treatment of Assange, um, and why. So I think in Australia he has he's had really right from 2011, 2012, he's had massive support. Um, some people believe some of those smears, but majority of people knew what was up. Um, there's been surveys in the last couple of years. I think two different surveys have been done. I think it was the Australian Assange campaign that did those surveys. So they basically paid a company to do a proper survey on the public opinion. And they basically found that of, people that understood the issue and knew what was going on with Assange, that about 80% of them supported his freedom. That was a previous survey. And when I heard about that one, I thought, well, what about the people that don't know about him? And so that's a big part of the aim of the film, is to educate people in the first place, but also those that the other 20% that think that he should be should have been sent to the US and thrown in a US jail and for 175 years. Well, why is that? Most likely it's because they believe those smears. But definitely massive support in Australia, and it's definitely grown since he became free and he basically received a hero's welcome. I think the support and the interest has grown even more. And look, in this country, this is a new country, Australia. It's only 240 years old. The white Australia anyway. Aboriginal, indigenous culture's been here. It's probably the oldest culture that's ever existed, over 100,000 years old. There's evidence of that it is the oldest culture. But the white Australia is so new, and it's built on convict labor. Most of the people that live here, our ancestors are convicts, rebels, people that were desperate and stole a loaf of bread and got put on a ship. Including some of my ancestors were convicts. And so there's a bit of a rebellious spirit here, even though we haven't ever had any sort of real revolution. People understand rebellion. They understand rebels, the underdog, as we call them. And, there's a legend of, I don't know if you've heard of Ned Kelly, who was basically a bushranger. He stole from people. There's nothing admirable about him at all, really, except that he rebelled. And it's a legend, the guy, he just basically stole from the rich, lived in the bush, and when everything went to crap, he just basically built some metal and put it over his head and like built this body armor. I guess it was one act of creativity that captured people's imagination. Builds some body armor and then has this sort of final stand, and basically they, 1 man against 100 police. And there's some interesting parallels between Ned Kelly and Assange. Assange is a rebel. He's stood up to authority, but he has done something incredibly significant for humanity, for our understanding of the world. He took them on, 1 man against the biggest empire that's ever existed. And he's basically won. But you have this incredible, thing that people need to realize, is that he did something, for our understanding of the world, towards, a world without wars, towards greater accountability, towards exposing war crimes and corruption. He's done that. And so I think more and more the Australian people are going to embrace him as, for what he is, which is an incredibly courageous, heroic person. Basically he threw his own body like a spanner into their war machine. He took them on like a David and Goliath story. So I think Australian people can really relate to that. You can sort of see it in the way the film has been embraced. When we first brought it out in Australia, we had no advertising budget, but we were getting full cinemas with hundreds of people. And then when we did take on investors and we were able to advertise, it absolutely blew up. It's the most watched Australian documentary of the year in cinemas. We've had 350 cinemas across Australia, New Zealand, UK. So we had people going to all kinds of lengths to convince their local cinema to show it, as far as, even collecting a petition to petition their local cinema. A lady in Bowral, south of Sydney, the cinema said to her, look, we can only book this film if you think you can bring 300 people. And not to be discouraged, she went and literally collected a list of people that wanted to come, went back to them, they put it on, and they ended up showing it 9 times down in this little town. And there were many stories like that in country towns where hundreds of people came to see it. So there's incredible interest and incredible support. It's nearly 7 months and the film is still running in Australian cinemas. We're getting rebookings since Julian was freed. And there's cinemas where it's been shown many, many times and it's still running. I think the record is a cinema in New Zealand called The Vic. It's in Auckland, New Zealand. They had 47 sessions of the film. So, interest in Australia, New Zealand has been extraordinary. UK, slightly less. I'm not sure if that's because of the weather. They prefer to watch comedy. They're all a bit depressed. Um, you know, greasy food and Guinness and comedy. Um, and but the response to the US is very different from US programmers. It's been way lower, and I think that's an interesting thing to talk about. Um, to what degree are US people, American people, scared to get behind this, and to what degree maybe half of them or so are actually uh, you know feel like Julian was a traitor and he's anti-American, which is ridiculous. But that is there was also a survey in America that showed that 52% of Americans believe that he should be on trial and he should be found guilty. So very different levels of support in America versus Australia, and we're seeing that reflected in the uptake so far from US cinemas. It's been a lot smaller so far, but I do hope that uh, this film, especially in light of Julian being freed, um, and all of the documentation of the work that he's done and so on, that hopefully there's a changing of opinion in regards to Julian in America, and also hopefully those that see the initial screenings of the Trust Fall in US cinemas will spread the word and realize, uh, you know, hopefully the film makes them feel embarrassed as US citizens that it's their government responsible for this persecution of an Australian journalist.
Yeah, and I think also with that, I think, kind of going back to what Nils Melzer talked about, is what I appreciated about your film is that it didn't talk down to the people who had these incorrect perspectives about Assange. As Nils says, like, I understand. I was with you, and I was the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. I mean, if you can fool him, then clearly, the rest of us have little hope of battling the immense propaganda machine. And so I really appreciated that you didn't talk down to people who had that perspective, but instead you invited them to change that perspective. And this is something that we've also seen, for instance, Kevin Gosztola, who wrote the book Guilty of Journalism, that covers the case of Julian Assange, who's been a frequent guest on this show as well, highlights that point very well, that the media created this. I mean, actually, I have to hand it to them, this brilliant campaign to smear Assange, much like they did with Snowden and Chelsea Manning. And this is what they do. They have a lot of practice.
It was an
And I
astounding campaign. They had 100 people on the task force to bring down Assange and WikiLeaks, and I think one of the most uh, compelling, sort of powerful examples of how to the lengths that they went to spin this narrative. It's something we forgot to put in the film, but uh, about a month before they knew already that the Ecuadorian government, had agreed that they could take Julian out of the embassy. So they had about a month to plan that scene, this bit of theater where Julian is carried out and put in a van like a criminal. So what they did was somebody stole his shaving equipment, his razor, his scissors, and when they pulled him out, he looks like a hobo. He looks bedraggled, long hair. He looks like a loser, and that's what they wanted to do. And that's not how Julian likes to present himself. He's an intellectual. He's dignified. He likes to be well presented. And, so that would have been distressing for him to be seen by, millions of people around the world like that. And then as soon as he arrived at Belmarsh, I think within a few days, we saw that leaked footage of him inside the prison, and he'd gone back to his usual self. He was clean shaven and he'd had a haircut, and that's how he would prefer to be. Um, and, that was the beginning of that narrative. Although actually it went a long way back. Sorry, of course, with the Swedish smear, where they took two women who'd just gone to the police for help to convince Julian to get an STI test, and somehow it gets all concocted into this whole rape allegation, and then all over the newspapers, front pages of all over the world. It was such a orchestrated, uh, so much effort that they put into bringing him down and undermining the public opinion of Assange over all those years.
And I want to talk a little bit about that because there's this having organized in the US for Assange, there was always this conversation with fellow organizers about how much we should spend time on on the personal side of things, and how much we should say, look, it doesn't matter if you like Julian or not. This is an atrocious way of dealing with somebody who's a journalist. And I wanted to ask you about that because you go both into his personal side of things. As I mentioned, you talk about him going back to his school days and wanting to use what he's learning about tech and things like that to really expose corruption and to uncover truth. What do you think the importance is of uncovering the personal aspect of Assange versus the professional? Like, how important do you think it is that people understand that this is somebody who's morally and ethically such a like an intensely morally driven person versus, look, it doesn't matter if you like him or not, but let's just focus on the fact that he's a journalist. What do you think the balance is there?
Yeah, interesting point. That's something I really considered deeply was, to what degree should we spend time in the film revealing the visions, the mission of Assange and WikiLeaks, and also his character. What is he like as a person? What's his personality? And I thought it was really important because, eh, most humans, not everybody, but most people do judge the book by its cover with other people. Uh, I've seen that myself in some of the um, interviews I've seen, and even an interview that I had on Talk TV in the UK when we were in London, a TV show there. The guy next to me, he was sort of like a commentator, and when it was his turn to talk, the first thing he said was, "I don't like Assange," and I just wanted to jump in and say, "Well, who cares? I don't care. No one cares whether you like him or not." Uh, I've heard so many comments from people and radio people and journalists, and even very recent articles where there was one, I can't remember the exact lines. He's someone described him. I think it was the Australian newspaper who very frequently liked to rip into Julian, and they said something like he's vulgar and he eats with his hands, and they were just looking for anything that they could find. You've had journalists criticize his hair because he's got this unusual appearance because he went grey so early in life. Um, Interestingly, his mother Christine told me over the phone not so long ago that his hair went grey when he went through a um, separation with his partner. When they had their first child, Daniel, as very young adults, and the stress of the court case where he was battling for custody of his son made his hair go grey. And so Julian's someone that's battled with lots of challenges in life, not only because he's um, taken on basically every country in the world by exposing their dirty laundry, but also he's had personal struggles. And he was a wonderful single father for that time as a very young man, looking after his son. Oh, you could go right into all of this stuff. In the film, we chose to start from his university days. I didn't want to go back too far because it was already going to be a long film and you can only fit so much in. We start from his university days, and I wanted to interview his friends at the time. And that was because I wanted them to paint a picture of this young adult Julian prior to WikiLeaks, like just before WikiLeaks. What was he like? And his friend at university, Niraj Lal, who's now a scientist, um, Niraj described him as, he was basically more ahead, further ahead than all the classes at university, and even ahead of the professors that were teaching it. So we got this picture of Julian as being incredibly bright, incredibly, basically a genius is my opinion. And then the wonderful Suella Dreyfus, who's a professor, probably the most eminent professor in Australia of encryption at the moment. And she knew Julian from way back in his sort of days as an ethical hacker, as someone that was interested in the creation of the internet in Australia. She met him on online forums and she described him as quirky, um, just an interesting character that didn't really care about what people thought about him. And then we had this archive footage of him, standing on a train station with an apple in his mouth, but he's not holding the apple, it's just hanging. And he is quirky. He's got his long gray hair and apple hanging from his mouth. And so he's always been an interesting character, someone that I would really love to meet. I was always fascinated with anyone that was a bit eccentric when I was at that age. And if you look back at some of Julian's early writings, some of the first books that he put out, and even some of his blogs, he was writing really interesting stuff. So he is a very interesting person. You could make a whole film on that stage of his life, but we just wanted to show that he was on a mission to end corruption, to expose crimes of the powerful. And as Suella Dreyfus said, and which ended up being one of the main lines in that chapter, which we call Genesis, the genesis of WikiLeaks, basically. She said that, that he had this burning desire to expose corruption, and he felt that if that was done, that we could have more. We could solve the inequity in society. Poor people would be less poor. So he saw a link between this sort of unabated power that a small number of people have in these the state, the empire, and the powerful countries of the West, and the trickle down effect where you have this poverty that exists and this rampant corruption that continues on. So he's always had this vision, and something that really also influenced my opinions of Julian was one of many interactions I had with people that knew him in his early life. I had this lady from Lismore contact me one day on Facebook out of the blue, and she said, "I've got pictures of Julian when he was 8 years old." And those were the photos at the beginning of the film where he's got a red jumper on and pulling faces. She used to work with his mother, Christine, and Christine would bring Julian along with her. And so her son and Julian would play together. And one day she asked Julian, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And he said, "I'm going to end corruption in the world." So, I had this picture of him. Suella Dreyfus also mentioned, which we didn't get to fit into the film, but she said when he was at uni, he was horrified to discover that the university was receiving funding to do research on weapons, the creation of, for example, how to make tanks that could drive, very comfortably over the top of dead bodies. He was just disgusted that they were using, university funds to assist war profiteers, companies that are constructing weapons. So, there's just an accumulation of all of these things that impelled Julian to, I think he was just always searching for something that he could do to make a difference. And when he came up with this idea of an anonymous Dropbox to protect whistleblowers using encryption, he was an encryption expert, and he just realized that this was, in combination with this new thing called the internet, where you could just have mountains of documents spread at little to no cost. And he just put all this together and came up with this invention that changed the world. And so, we wanted to simultaneously humanize Julian, show a little bit of what he's like, and there's swearing. He's just, we want to just show that he's a human, and he was on a mission. He's an interesting character, an intellectual, but above all, that he is a compassionate person that cares about the state of the world and wants to make a positive difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And that definitely comes across. And I think what you're saying also points to something that I highlight as well when I do, frontline trainings and things like that, or speaking to folks who are curious about, oh, how do I become an activist? And it's like there's no such thing as a professional or an expert activist. It's just people who decide that they care deeply about something or some things. They see injustice and they want to make it just, and they use whatever skills they have. I mean, you pointed out that he was really good at encryption. So, okay, how can I use that to address this idea that I've had since I was 8 to end corruption? Oh, this is a way to do that. And so I think it's, again, like just taking the thing that you're passionate about or that you're really good at and tying that into addressing injustices that you see. And I think that's a really powerful message as well. And we could talk about this for days, and I would definitely recommend that people take a couple of hours to check out this film. You can check it out, the trailer and more information about it at thetrustfall.org. But finally, Kym, wrapping up here, I think a good thing that you kind of prophetically highlighted on that website is Julian Assange will not be saved by the law. He will be saved by the actions of the public. And so I just wrapping up here, any final thoughts on kind of the arc of making this film where he was started and he was obviously still imprisoned and being tortured? How do you feel that arc has come to ground again? And how do you see this film project with regards to what's happened with Assange and what could happen moving forward with his continued drive to address corruption?
Yeah, it's a fascinating outcome and situation. Firstly, it's just absolutely wonderful that Julian is free, that he's a free man with his family back in Australia, that he's alive. This is a victory. Stefania Marizia did a great post on X where she said, the outcome of this is that we now know that you can expose the crimes of the powerful, including war crimes, really serious crimes, and survive. He wasn't executed. He wasn't assassinated. They plotted to, the CIA under Mike Pompeo, under Trump, plotted to poison him or kill him in some way. They tried to kill him by keeping him in the embassy and in Belmarsh for a combined more than 12 years. But he didn't lose his mind. He's still together. He's still alive. And he certainly has health issues to address, and he needs to recover, but he is alive, and that is a wonderful thing. And we're left with a precedent that's been set, which is not it's a shocking thing that a journalist has been convicted of espionage under the Espionage Act. And this is the first time a journalist has been convicted. They've thought about it and tried it before. It's an antiquated 1917 Espionage Act, more than 100 years old. Now it's been used against a journalist, and used against the world in that way, because it reduces our ability to know what's going on, what's being done in our name. So this is a precedent that's been set. It's really important that the campaign now moves towards pardoning it, getting a pardon for Assange, and compensation as well for all the suffering that he's endured and his family. They've all been terrorized. They're all victims. And as Nils Melzer said, this was, they use intimidation, this threat of legal action and jail time against journalists. But it's not, in the case of Assange, it was to intimidate the whole world. I really agree with that. And so I think the campaign now will move towards pardoning Assange. That again will require more awareness. The trust fall can be part of that. The trust fall was one small part of creating the pressure that resulted in Julian's freedom. I think that his freedom came about primarily. Of course, there was diplomacy and legal efforts involved, uh, and just so many different. The whole campaign was run from so many different angles and involved so many people and groups, and you could talk about that for a long time. But the main thing was the public support. It was the public pressure, because that was growing day by day. And I think the US knew that. They knew that they couldn't have a journalist arrive onto US shores in handcuffs leading up to the election. It wasn't going to look good. So, they still got their little token one count of the indictment that Julian had to plead guilty to in order to save his own life. It was a life or death situation for him. He couldn't have survived much longer in those situations, especially if they got worse in the US. If he was tortured there, the torture continued, the stress continued. So, it was the efforts of many, many people all around the world that created this pressure, combined with the legal battle and the diplomacy. And that resulted in saving the life of someone very courageous and very heroic. And now he has an opportunity, if he so chooses, when he recovers, to be somewhat involved. And to what extent, we won't know. That's up to him. It'd be fascinating to see what he does next, even if it is just to have a quiet life, write a few books, and get back onto his Twitter page and have some sort of voice. Certainly, I said in the film, wherever Julian goes, free speech goes with him. And Julian and Stella have become really the loudest voices for free speech of our times. And it's wonderful to think that, even if he can just resume having some sort of public discourse and some involvement in the world, his voice is going to be louder than ever. We can't wait to hear it. And if he does decide to go back to some sort of involvement in politics and world events, then that'll be an exciting thing to see.
Absolutely. And lest we forget the Espionage Act, I would say to folks listening in the US, which is most of our audience, I feel that an important next step is just getting rid of the Espionage Act, because the Espionage Act was created to go after activists. I mean, the likes of Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman were some of the first people to be in the crosshairs of the Espionage Act. So this was created, like a lot of legislation in the United States, to go after people who go after the empire. So I think that's an important next step for folks here. Kym, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us. Again, folks can go to thetrustfall.org. This film will be out in the United States July 17th. And for any of my fellow Swedes listening, we'll work on that too. Kym, thank you again so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Eleanor. Thank you so much for this coverage of the release in the US of the Trust Fall, and also your support of Assange and free speech in general. All of your efforts in that is wonderful. What you've done.
Thank you. Likewise.
Keep up the great work. Take care.